Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, isn't just one of America's most prestigious medical institutions. It's the birthplace of modern surgery. In 1846, in a circular amphitheater known as the Ether Dome, doctors first used anesthesia to perform painless surgery, changing medicine forever. But what they don't tell you in medical school is that some patients from those early experiments never really left. My name is Dr. Amanda Foster, and I was a surgical resident at Mass General. I thought I understood the weight of medical history, the significance of walking the same halls where medical pioneers once worked. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered in the Ether Dome during a winter night that would haunt me forever. It was February 2023, one of those brutal New England winters where the wind cuts through you like a scalpel. I was in my second year of residency, working mostly night shifts in the trauma unit. Mass General at night has this almost cathedral-like quality. The old brick buildings, the long corridors lined with portraits of distinguished physicians, the weight of over 2 centuries of medical history pressing down on you. I had heard stories about the Ether Dome, of course. Every resident did. It sits at the top of the Bullfinch building, this perfectly preserved 19th century operating theater where medical history was made. During the day, it's a museum of sorts, with tours for medical students and visitors. But at night, it's supposedly locked and empty. The stories varied depending on who was telling them. Some said you could still smell ether in the air on quiet nights. Others claimed they'd heard screaming coming from the dome during the early morning hours, the cries of patients from an era before anesthesia was perfected, when surgery was a brutal, agonizing ordeal that many didn't survive. My attending physician, Dr. Richardson, was one of the skeptics. He'd been at Mass General for 30 years and dismissed the stories as resident folklore designed to scare newcomers. But even he admitted there was something unsettling about the upper floors of the old building after midnight. Everything changed on February 14th, Valentine's Day. Ironically, I was covering the trauma unit when we received a call about a accident on I-93. Multiple casualties were incoming, and we needed every available OR. As I was prepping for surgery, I noticed something strange in the scheduling system. Operating Room 7, which doesn't exist, was listed as occupied, with the surgery scheduled from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. When I mentioned this to the charge nurse, she went pale. Room 7 is what we used to call the Ether Dome, she whispered. The system shouldn't even have that designation anymore. Curiosity got the better of me. After finishing my surgeries around 2:30 a.m., I decided to investigate. I took the old service elevator to the 4th floor of the Bullfinch building. The hallways up there are different from the rest of the hospital, narrower, with higher ceilings, and this oppressive feeling, like you're walking through a tomb. The door to the Ether Dome should have been locked, but it was slightly ajar. Through the crack, I could see a faint, flickering light, not electric lighting, but something that looked like ... candlelight. I pushed the door open and stepped into a nightmare. The Ether Dome was exactly as it had been in 1846. The circular amphitheater, with its tiered seating, was filled with men in Victorian dress, medical students and physicians in dark suits and high collars. In the center of the room, on the original operating table, lay a patient, a young woman who appeared to be conscious and terrified. Standing over her was a tall, gaunt figure in a black coat. I recognized him from the portraits in the hospital lobby. Dr. John Collins Warren, the surgeon who had performed the first public demonstration of ether anesthesia. But this wasn't a historical reenactment. This was something far more sinister. The woman on the table was awake, her eyes wide with terror, but she couldn't move or speak. Dr. Warren was holding what looked like a primitive surgical saw, preparing to begin an amputation without any anesthesia at all. "The ether has failed again," he announced to the assembled crowd in a voice that echoed strangely in the dome. "But the advancement of medical science requires sacrifice. We must proceed." That's when I realized the horrible truth. These weren't historical recreations. These were the botched experiments. The patients who had died on this table during the early, imperfect attempts at anesthesia. They were trapped here, doomed to repeat their final, agonizing moments over and over again. The woman on the table turned her head toward me, and I saw absolute terror in her eyes. Her mouth moved silently, forming a single word: help. I tried to move, tried to speak, but I found myself frozen, as if I were part of the audience that had gathered to witness this medical horror show. Dr. Warren raised the saw, and I knew I was about to watch this woman experience the most excruciating death imaginable. But then something extraordinary happened. The other spectators, the Victorian medical students and physicians, began to turn toward me. Their faces were not those of the living. They were pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and expressions of infinite sadness. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been older than 25, stood up and pointed at me. "She doesn't belong here," he said in a voice that sounded like wind through autumn leaves. "This one still has the power to heal, not harm." The scene began to fade, like an old photograph left in the sun. Dr. Warren's surgical instruments dissolved into mist, and the woman on the table sat up, no longer paralyzed by terror. She looked at me with grateful eyes before she too began to fade away. The last thing I heard was the young medical student's voice. "Remember us, doctor. Remember that every breakthrough in medicine comes with a cost. Don't let our suffering be in vain." When I came to, I was sitting in a chair in the modern Ether Dome Museum. It was 6 a.m., and the morning security guard was shaking my shoulder. "Doctor, you okay? How did you get in here? This area's been locked all night." I couldn't explain what had happened. I still can't. But I did some research afterward and discovered that the young medical student who had spoken to me was Thomas Whitman, a Harvard medical student who had died in 1847 during a botched appendectomy, one of the early experimental surgeries where the anesthesia had failed. His name is carved on a memorial plaque in the Ether Dome, along with dozens of others, patients who had died during those early, imperfect attempts to eliminate surgical pain. I finished my residency at Mass General, but I never went back to the Ether Dome. I didn't need to. The experience had taught me something that no textbook ever could, that medical progress isn't just about innovation and discovery. It's about remembering the human cost of that progress and honoring the patients who suffered so that future generations wouldn't have to. Sometimes, late at night when I'm performing surgery, I think I can smell ether in the air. Not the harsh chemical smell of modern anesthesia, but something older, sweeter, tinged with the memory of fear and pain. And I remembered Thomas Whitman's words, "Don't let our suffering be in vain." Because at Massachusetts General Hospital, the past isn't really past. It lives on in every surgery, every life saved, every moment when a patient goes under anesthesia, trusting that they'll wake up whole and pain-free. The Ether Dome taught me that some ghosts don't haunt to frighten, they haunt to remind us of the sacred responsibility we carry as healers. And that's a lesson worth remembering, no matter how terrifying it might be to learn.